Mr. Martinez, you may continue with cross-examination.
Ma'am, your assessment in this case and your opinion in this case was based in large part on an interview that you had with the defendant, correct?
In part.
Oh, so it's a 50-50 kind of split?
When I take a case, I explore every aspect of that case that I can.
Next question.
So in this case, though, you did talk to the defendant, correct?
Yes, I did.
And you made a determination in your mind that she was being truthful, correct?
I made an assessment that it was worth pursuing.
Ma'am, do you remember that you and I had a conversation, and during that conversation that you told me you found the defendant to be truthful?
I found the defendant to be credible, and I would move on with my investigation.
Which means you found her to be truthful, right?
All right?
No, not all right. Isn't that what you found?
I found her to be credible. Yes, I did.
And credible means the same thing as being truthful, right?
I found her to be believable, yes.
And believable means truthful, right?
You're asking me for a yes or no, Mr. Martinez, and what I would say to you is I found her to be believable enough so that I would continue with the case.
So you believed her, is what you're saying?
I believed enough to be able to continue with the case.
And when you say that you believed enough, it seems to leave open the fact that perhaps you didn't believe some of the things that she was saying.
It said that I was willing to pursue the case.
I'm not asking you about whether or not you were willing to pursue the case. Do you remember that when we started this exchange, you and I asked you about your assessment? Do you remember that and your opinion?
Yes, I do.
I'm asking you about the assessment and the opinion. Your assessment and opinion is based in part, as you said, on your conversation with the defendant, right?
Correct.
And you found her during that those conversations to be believable, right?
I found her to be believable in terms of what I talked to her about at that time.
So the answer is yes, you found her believable during those 44 hours, correct?
I found her to be believable. You're asking me about my first or my entire 44 hours?
My question indicated 44 hours, ma'am. Do you understand that?
I do understand that, Mr. Martinez.
All right, then, in those 44 hours, did you find her to be believable?
Yes, I did.
And that's part of the reason why you came in and gave us the opinion that you gave us in this case, right?
In part.
That's right. And are you familiar with the concept of secondary gain?
Yes, I am.
And the concept of secondary gain is that in situations such as this, if it's to the person's benefit, they may be deceitful, correct?
They may be deceitful.
And in this case, you found no issue with regard to the secondary gain involving this defendant, right?
I met Ms. Arias.
Judge, she's non-responsive. It's a yes or no.
Sustained. Can you answer yes or no, please?
It's not really a yes or no question.
Then we will move on.
Okay.
Ma'am, with regard to this particular case, the thought of secondary gain, did that even enter your mind?
Sure.
And did you assess it?
There's not a real way to assess secondary gain other than by looking at collateral data, which I looked at.
Yes or no? Did you consider the issue of secondary gain in this case?
I said that I did.
And with regard to this issue of secondary gain, you, after whatever assessment that you made or whatever you considered, you decided that the issue, there was no secondary gain issue in this case, right?
I did not make an assessment of whether there was secondary gain in terms of looking, once I had looked at all the other information. There's always something that you put in the back of your head, Mr. Martinez, about what somebody's secondary gain might be. And so you take that picture and you investigate that picture and you pull in your collateral sources to do that, Mr. Martinez. And that's what I did.
So
I pulled in all the sources that I could possibly pull in to be able to assess.
So your conclusion is, based on whatever it is that you did in your mind, ma'am, your conclusion is that there was no secondary gain here, right?
I never said no secondary gain or secondary gain. I looked at all of the material and believed Miss Arias confessed to the crime.
Judge, she's not being responsive to the question. It's yes or no.
Ask another question.
with regard to this issue of secondary gain, ma'am, whether you looked at material, whether you didn't look at material, whether you did 44 hours or whether you did 38 and a half, however you looked at it, when whatever you considered, isn't it true that you really didn't reach a decision with regard to secondary gain in this case?
I considered it in my decision, Mr. Martinez.
So you did consider the issue of secondary gain and decided that there was no problem with that particular issue in this case?
I decided that there was domestic violence.
Judge, she's just not being responsive here.
Sustained. May
Yes
approach.
or no? Did you rule out secondary gain with regard to the defendant?
I did not rule out secondary gain.
Since you did not rule out this issue of secondary gain, isn't it true, ma'am, that because your assessment was lacking in that aspect, that she, the defendant, could have been less than truthful with you in those 44 hours that you spoke with her?
I didn't rule out secondary gain. I looked at it in the context of all the other information. I was limited to looking at domestic violence, and I was to assess whether I believed there was domestic violence. And Mr. Martinez, I assessed that there was. That was what I was supposed to do.
Sustained. Next question.
We know what you were there to do, but in assessing domestic violence, you by necessity have to take into account what the defendant is saying, whether or not she's being truthful, correct?
Correct.
And that involves the issue of secondary gain, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
And in this case, you just told us that you did not rule it out, which means that you did not, in this case, complete an assessment that was free, if you will, of this issue of the defendant being truthful.
There's not an assessment that rules out secondary gain, Mr. Martinez.
Well, when you sit and you talk to somebody, one of the things that we talked about yesterday was whether or not you were the human lie detector. One of the things that you do have to do is make an assessment as part of your investigation as to whether or not an individual is telling you the truth or not, correct?
There is always reasonable doubt, Mr. Martinez. That's what this
Objection,
whole...
non-responsive.
No, it is responsive.
You may finish your question, or finish your answer, excuse me.
Reasonable doubt is part of what you go into this with, I hope. Reasonable doubt is part of what any expert witness would go into a situation with. Reasonable doubt is what the jury goes in with. It's what you go in with, and then you build your foundation, and you look to see whether or not you have the foundation for this. I believed I have the foundation for this, or I would never have proceeded.
With regard to this issue of reasonable doubt, that's the standard that you applied then. Is that what you're saying?
I always...
Yes or no?
Sure.
And in this case, when you were assessing the defendant's statement, even though you did not rule out secondary gain, you applied this other standard of reasonable doubt, right?
I apply...
Yes or no?
It's a semantics thing, and I don't know where you go with this.
All right. Do you have an objection?
Non-responsive.
Sustained. Next question.
So, ma'am, you did use the word beyond a reasonable doubt, didn't you?
I did. I used the word reasonable doubt.
Yes, you did, with regard to this issue of what you, in your assessment of the defendant's statements to you, right?
I have skepticism when I go in and I look at that. I have doubt. Of course I have doubt.
I'm not asking you whether or not you had doubt. I'm asking you, with regard to this case and the defendant's statement, why it was that you did not rule out this issue about whether or not she could have been less than truthful with you.
I didn't say I didn't look at that.
So you did rule it out then?
I didn't entirely rule out anything.
So are you saying you did believe her or not? Which of the two?
I believed her, and I continue, as I do with my other cases, to keep an open mind about what may come up. So when I do a case, I can pull out of that case at any time if I don't believe...
I'm not asking you if you can pull out of a case. I am asking you whether or not you believed her in this evaluation. That's all I'm asking you.
Yes, I believe her.
And one of the things that you did in this particular evaluation is only talk to her, correct?
In what part of the evaluation?
Any part of the evaluation. Isn't it true that you did not talk to you didn't talk to Mr. Alexander, did you?
No, I did not.
You didn't talk to any of the other witnesses, right?
No, I did not.
The only person that you talked to was the defendant, right?
Correct.
And so in basing your opinion, you based it on large part or small part on the word of one person that was involved in the relationship, right?
I based it on all of the information that I read, not just on Miss. I read
I'm talking about
for
witnesses.
hours and hours and hours more than just looking at Miss Arias.
I understand that you want to tell us that you reviewed, you sat in your office and you read. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the mouth moving and you talking to somebody else and their mouth moving. Do we understand that that's what I'm asking?
I understand.
And with regard to that particular issue, there was only one person that you talked to, and that was the defendant, right?
Correct.
And in your assessment of these things, there are always two sides to every issue, aren't there?
In domestic violence, the saying goes that as opposed to the truth being somewhere in the middle, that the truth is worse than either story because both people are minimizing and denying the story.
You didn't speak to Mr. Alexander or anybody else about whether or not she was minimizing or changing the story or anything, right?
Or whether he was.
Exactly. Whether anybody was, correct?
I read his words, as many as I had.
Ma'am, I'm talking about talking to people.
Of course, I did not talk to other people, Mr. Martinez. I did not.
One of the things that you told us with regard to these type of evaluations is that 90% of all communication is nonverbal, right?
Sure, you can take that any way you want.
Yes or no? That's how I want to take it.
It's not yes or no.
You didn't testify to that previously in this court?
I made a statement.
Yes or no? Did you testify to that?
In a verbal conversation, much like you and I are having, I bet people here can read in what's going on non-verbally between the two of us, and that's what I was talking about.
I'm not interested in what you may be feeling with regard to the prosecutor. I'm asking whether or not you made the statement that in a clinical interview, 90% of the communication is nonverbal. Did you make that statement?
Yes.
And with regard to this interview that you had with the defendant, one of the people that was involved in it was missing because he's been killed, right?
Yes.
And so if we apply the mathematics to it, you have a 45% chance of being wrong just right off the bat because you don't have the other person there.
No.
One of the other things that you told us yesterday was that for you, the defendant told the truth as you knew it throughout her life. But yet, when this killing happened, that's when she had problems with the truth, right? That's what you told me yesterday, right?
Yes.
Which means that you, by chance or by design, investigated her truthfulness before this incident, right?
Yes.
Did you speak to her father about her truthfulness growing up?
No, I did not.
Don't you agree that, what is his name?
Bill.
Don't you agree that Bill Arias would know about whether or not the defendant had been truthful growing up?
He would have a view of her truthfulness for sure.
Right, just like anything you tell us now is a view of her truthfulness, isn't it?
Correct.
And don't you think that his view of her truthfulness has a much better basis than yours?
He has a much longer history with her, and he has a questionable history with her.
Whether or not he has a questionable history with her, she grew up in his house, didn't she?
She did.
He saw her on a day-to-day basis, right?
He did.
You didn't, did you?
No, I did not.
He dealt with her when she went to school, right?
Correct.
And he dealt with her whenever she had any issues. You did not, right?
Correct.
And he would know better than you whether or not the defendant had a reputation for honesty.
Oh, yeah.
And so, did you review his conversation with the detective in which he talked about the defendant's truthfulness after the age of 14?
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to go back to the jury room for approximately 10 minutes.